All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. So, I am Andrew, and for the purposes of today's video, aka King Postmodern Mindgasms, and today I'm talking about the fact that I just learned recently, which is that the Spartans were pedophiles. They had a ritualized pedophilia practice, talk about the morality of it and whether it was right or wrong, relate that to Foucault and what he says about the history of sexuality and pedophilia and other sexual classifications like homosexuality that he talks about in that book called A History of Sexuality, along with what Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay have said about pedophilia, but specifically in relation to postmodernism on the part of Jordan Peterson and critical race theory on the part of James Lindsay. So, like I said, I recently learned from a documentary that I was watching that the Spartans had ritualized pedophilia practice, and so I thought this was a really interesting thing because, of course, a lot of people have seen that movie 300 with the brave 300 Spartans, and they go to stop the evil Persian army. Of course, it's a movie based on the graphic novel that's based on a legend that's based on actual history. So there's a lot of there's a lot of poetic license there, like a lot of really over the top stuff. But I think it's pretty awesome over the top stuff, like a lot of other people do anyway. So it's still definitely an awesome movie. Like we see the awesome, jacked and shredded Spartans slaughtering a whole bunch of Persians in slow motion to fight for their country and to literally become martyrs to uh, provoke Greek into being in the war because Sparta was a Greek city state. But yeah, so anyway, the point of this is that I learned that the Spartans had ritualized pedophilia practice, which I thought was very interesting. Um, and also, they had another thing that they don't tell you in the movie is that they had this whole warrior culture that was just designed to produce as many warriors as possible and with the goal of just dying a glorious death in battle for their country. And so all of the it is true that the if there were any deformed children, they were thrown off cliffs, any children born with disabilities or anything like that. And if you were born a boy at a certain age, they did send you to the agoge here, which is the Spartan warrior training school. And we and also the ritualized pedophilia practice itself, how that worked is that, so of course all of the Spartan men tried to become soldiers, and that was the most coveted position in Spartan society, right? So basically, if Spartans survived long enough and survived enough wars, at a certain point, they would be they they would train the next generation of soldiers. So the the mothers and fathers would raise their children to a certain age, and then they would get taken to these men who were former soldiers, and they would basically, in this documentary anyway, it said that the men perform the role of fathers, teachers, and lovers. So they were like their father figures, but they would also fuck them and presumably rape them a lot, and then they were also teaching them to be soldiers. So obviously, it must have been like fucking horrifying and confusing in innumerable ways, for this to happen to the young boys that were being raised to be soldiers. And it was like this was such a normalized part of society. The older soldiers would do this, but it was still the case that younger men would get married and have wives so that they could have children. So it was kind of like ritualized bisexuality in a way for the men who were at the top level of the society in particular. They would get married and have wives, and then later on in life, they would fucking rape boys as part of their and like I said, it was a ritualized practice as a part of their culture. So this aspect of this made me think about Michel Foucault, as I said, and his book called The History of Sexuality, and he talks about different types of sexualities in that book and how the basically the history and the morality behind pedophilia, like how it was a very normal thing throughout history, pedophilia for specifically for men to have sex with younger boys, and it wasn't seen as morally wrong by that society. But that doesn't, as many people confuse Foucault's position on this, that doesn't mean that he supported or advocated for pedophilia. He sure as fuck did not do that. He was just pointing out that pedophilia, along with other types of sexualities, were these ways of being a human that were looked at, that were basically, they put them into these new categories. The institutions of the modern era, like science and religion, created these new categories like pedophilia and homosexuality that had never existed before in order to normalize heterosexuality and all that kind of stuff, and in order to demonize these people, but specifically through the institutions of science and religion, to label particularly homosexuals, for example, as sinful and medically flawed in the same way as pedophiles. Now, again, this is not to say, and Foucault sure as fuck does not say this either, that this means that pedophiles are just as much of victims as gay people. Of course not. He sure doesn't fucking say that. He was gay himself, so he's biased, but he wasn't like supporting or advocating pedophilia at any point in his entire fucking life either. He was just saying that this is an abnormal thing, and we see it, the way that we as a society see sexual practice changes throughout history in our culture. We see pedophilia as wrong now, and I think, and I'm sure Foucault thought too, this is probably correct. Like, it's morally wrong to be a fucking pedophile, of course. Just like how it was morally wrong for this, it was not only morally wrong for the Spartans rather, to practice pedophilia, it was also wrong for the Spartans to have slavery, of course, right? But we can still analyze these things in a historical context. And it's just interesting that these things that are widely regarded as moral evils in today's world are seen as just normal and morally just throughout the majority of human history. Now, I mentioned how Foucault was a gay person himself, and I mentioned a lot how he uses homosexuality in his book called History of Sexuality to demonstrate how this category of homosexuality has been created in order to separate gay people from so-called straight people, and in order to, through the modern institutions of science and religion, label them as sinners and medically flawed people. So whether you're gay or lesbian or anything like that, and it's it's interesting because a lot of what people say when they criticize so-called postmodernists like Foucault is that they think that postmodernists were for creating these endless categories through which we should identify people by very specific terms and create an endless succession of new categories and new really specific boxes that we have that we have invented through our modern institutions of science and religion and government and all the rest. And but the fucking stupid thing about this is that this is totally fucking antithetical to especially what post-structuralists or so-called postmodernists like Foucault said himself. And his point in talking about sexuality, like pedophilia and heterosexuality in particular, of course, because that's not morally wrong to practice, and pedophilia is, in my opinion. Um, that like basically the argument is it's a problem to create these endless new categories that we put people into this endlessly increasing number of boxes. That's a problem because it's a way to it serves only to separate and divide us and point out how different we are instead of pointing out how similar we are, because all human beings are far more similar than we are different. We're 99% genetically similar, right? And so, like, if you want to say, I don't know, I'm like gay, bi, queer, gender fluid, I identify as a dragon or an attack helicopter or anything like that, I would bet money on the claim that Foucault would be totally against this endless creation of fucking categories because it's just all fucking stupid virtue signaling for people to make themselves feel better about themselves. So this is where uh, public public intellectuals like Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay come in. So Jordan Peterson, of course, my hobby horse is criticizing him for endlessly strawmanning postmodernism and Foucault in particular. And I haven't seen him talk that much about Foucault in terms of pedophilia, especially. But he's definitely basically made this endless straw man about Foucault, which is that basically Foucault supports this endless creation of categories and wants to normalize this fucking crazy bullshit and take that, and deconstruction is literally Derrida's word. Deconstruction is literally meant for advocating for tearing down all the institutions of modern society like science and religion and government, and just replacing them with like this postmodern society, which no one even really knows what the fuck that would mean, because Foucault and Derrida never advocated for anything even remotely like any of that shit. Deconstruction was a purely rhetorical and analytical exercise. It wasn't about engineering it wasn't about engineering jack shit. So this shit is fucking stupid. But anyway, um, this book called Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks is where Jordan Peterson gets all his strawmans about Foucault from, because he hasn't actually read Foucault himself. And Pete and Stephen Hicks basically strawmans Foucault all the time too. He takes all these paragraphs out of context and presents them in ways that are totally opposite from the way that they're meant when Foucault's writing them in that book. And he also talks about how Foucault talks about pedophilia from a moral and philosophical and historical perspective, but he basically gets his intention totally fucking wrong, and he's mind reading and assuming that the reason that Foucault brings this up is that he wants to actually fucking actively advocate for and apologize for pedophilia, which is stupid, which is really fucking stupid. Now, this also relates to James Lindsay, who I mentioned. He's become one of my hobby horses for intellectuals who I pick on because he he kind of stopped strawmanning Foucault a while ago. To be fair, because he's moved to a different target. So, but in his book with Helen Pluckrose called Cynical Theories, basically the whole fucking mission of the book was to strawman Foucault and blame post for on the part of both of them for them to blame Foucault and Derrida and postmodernism for this like fucking stupid wokeness shit, these crazy purple-haired people crying about oppression on college campuses. But he's moved on from that. Maybe he actually would acknowledge that Foucault is not behind all this crazy stupid shit, but who knows? Anyway, he's always talking about critical race theory now, and that's relevant to um, pedophilia in terms of how I brought that up in terms of how the Spartans had ritualized practice of pedophilia in the first place, because Foucault, or not Foucault, I almost just called James Lindsay Foucault, but as I was talking about recently on my podcast the other day with Dusty and Chris, there's this recent news that James Lindsay decided to not do his lecture series with Thaddeus Russell, the historian from his renegade university, because Thaddeus Russell had a conversation about this, like what Foucault talks about in his book called History of Sexuality, about how uh, a, basically an approach to it, an analytical approach to it from the perspective of morality and philosophy and history, examining how it was it was considered pretty normal and morally good and not a bad thing throughout history for pedophilia to be just a good, like not even necessarily a good thing perhaps, but just a normal thing, as I said. So from that perspective, like I was saying, it would it was seen as normal throughout history, and like slavery, this is actually progress of the modern era if you look at it really, because slavery and pedophilia are wrong and terrible horrors that have been perpetuated and normalized throughout history. So this is just a way of looking how this changes with something like homosexuality, so called, which I'm sure Foucault would think is a stupid term in itself to begin with. uh, this is obviously the opposite of something like slavery or pedophilia, because uh, because because homosexuality is not morally wrong, and something like slavery and pedophilia are totally fucking morally wrong, right? So anyway, in terms of pedophilia and James Lindsay and him rage quitting his lecture on, so he rage like I said, he rage quit his lecture on, well, not rage quit perhaps. I think he's supposedly still on good terms with Thaddeus Russell. But anyway, he is not doing his lecture on critical race theory anymore. And like I said, this is relevant to pedophilia because on his channel that he created, his YouTube channel, he's been spreading a lot of, like I said, he's moved to a new target from postmodernism and has been strawmanning critical race theory and basically going around claiming that critical race theorists like Robin DiAngelo and Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram X. Kennedy are critical race theorists, even though they themselves say that they're not critical race theorists. And if you read critical race theorist books, uh, they themselves say when they talk about these people that they don't match with them. Um, Ibram X. Kennedy himself has, of course, said that he is not critical race theory. He's been inspired by it, but he hasn't even studied it, and he is not critical race theory. And also, James Lindsay mentions Kimberly Crenshaw a lot, who is a famous critical race theorist author, and she herself has said that the definition of intersectionality that Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility, of course, uses is totally incorrect. And also, critical race theorists themselves disagree with each other a lot. Kimberly Crenshaw disagrees with Derek Bell, for example, who James Lindsay also mentions and is a seminal author in critical race theory, who argues for incrementalism and argues in one of his books that basically black school desegregation, the Supreme Court rule that that put into action black school desegregation in the 50s was a mistake. Now, where James Lindsay gets this wrong when he talks about Derek Bell is that he claims that that basically this means that Derek Bell is a black supremacist and he's a segregationist and blacks shouldn't mix with whites and all this kind of stupid shit like what Malcolm X believed before his deconversion from radical terrorist Islam. But what is actually the truth is that he thought black school desegregation was a mistake in the way that it was enacted. He talked about how the separate but equal clause should have been focused on instead of just assuming that separate that combining white people with black people will solve all these disparities of disproportionate outcomes between black people and white people. Now, this is actually kind of a conservative sounding point, like something like what the economist Thomas Sowell has talked about before. So he's not this radical woke critical race theorist guy. At least depending on what you read, like some of his stuff is more so than other stuff, but I'm forgetting the name of that book right now where he talks about black school desegregation, but that book in particular is different from his one of his other books, like Faces at the Bottom of the Well, which is a little different. But again, like I said, there's a lot of difference between critical race theorists and these like woke anti-racist people like Ibram X. Kennedy, Robin DiAngelo, and Ta-Nehisi Coates. There's a lot of difference between different critical race theorists like Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell. And intersectionality is different from critical race theory, and sometimes they're connected, but they're also totally separate things too. And there's difference between the ways in which these individual authors write their different books. So you can't just paint this whole fucking thing of critical race theory as a monolith. Now, I went into that way more than I intended. But anyway, one thing that James Lindsay does in terms of pedophilia is he's been making videos on his YouTube channel called The New Discourses about how basically critical race theorists are doing fucking pedophile grooming. So this is another example of this fucking totally unfounded paranoia, his fucking crackpot crazy conspiracy theory about how the critical race theorists are basically trying to take down Western society with their evil COVID regime, or I should say Decepticon regime. Um, and engage in a new world order and combine communism and fascism with this race Marxism, communo-fascism, even though racism and Marxism are totally antithetical to each other. Marxists hate critical race theory for the most part, and critical race theory think that race is way more important to focus on than class. But anyway, so the point of this is that I just think it's interesting that throughout human history, something like pedophilia has been seen as morally good or at least morally neutral, and it's been normalized. And this has changed. And that's basically the only point. And the I forgot to mention the reason that James Lindsay got mad at Thaddeus Russell about the podcast about the and why he didn't do the critical race theory series was because he was talking with this Thaddeus Russell was talking with his philosopher named Stephen Kirshner, and they were talking philosophically about the concept of pedophilia in the same way as Foucault does, that and he talks about how age of consent laws, for example, are somewhat arbitrary in that a 17-year-old can have sex with a 17-year-old, but a 20-year-old cannot have sex. And how much of a difference is there really? And if two 17-year-olds have sex, is that pedophilia? If they sext each other, is that child pornography? And that doesn't mean that you're advocating for pedophilia. It just means that age of consent laws vary between provinces, states, and countries because different societies have different rules for what qualifies as pedophilia because of the different consent laws. So we all make these arbitrary definitions, but that doesn't mean that anyone advocates for adults having sex with children. Like at a certain age, everyone pretty much fucking agrees that it's fucking disturbing and fucked up and wrong for someone of a certain age to have someone with a, like, there's an age that's too young, basically, right? Of course. And that's like, basically everyone acknowledges that it's fucking evil and the most horrifying shit ever to actually like rape children. Like, that's the most evil thing that I can think of, and probably almost anyone else too. But anyway, so that's why James Lindsay didn't do that critical race theory lecture, because he can't understand that fucking nuance point because of his hatred and lack of understanding of the nuance in Foucault's point about just examining something like pedophilia from a historical, philosophical, and analytical perspective, not while also making moral judgments. So anyway, the the Spartans had ritualized pedophilia practice, which is fascinating that that was such a major part of human history, even though it was so morally wrong, just like slavery, for example. And it's just and I think the way that people like Stephen Kirchner and Foucault analyze this from a philosophical and historical perspective is really interesting. Even though none of the above, including me, of course, like I said, uh, are making any or like morally apologizing for or approving of pedophilia in any fucking way. I'm sure all of us would say it's fucking evil. And Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay are seemingly incapable of actually doing the requisite research to understand this nuance, or like either they're too intellectually lazy, or they just haven't understood the full details of the nuance of this in particular. So anyway, I just thought about all these issues, and this documentary I watched about how the Spartans, it wasn't specifically about that, but that was the most fascinating aspect to of it to me, because it's such a morally terrible but normalized thing, as I said. And that reminded me of this whole scandal over James Lindsay not doing that critical race theory lecture series with Thaddeus Russell, because it's so controversial to talk about pedophilia, which shouldn't be such a dangerous thing. You can talk about slavery from a moral perspective too. That doesn't mean that you're automatically apologizing for or advocating for slavery either. And Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay seem either unwilling or incapable of understanding nuance in terms of the subject of postmodernism and critical racism in general, and pedophilia specifically, if we're talking about someone like Foucault or Stephen Kirchner analyzing it from a philosophical and historical perspective. All right, so anyway, as usual, I talked for way longer than I intended and got into way more than I intended to. But anyway, thanks everyone for watching. Hope you enjoyed my little rant about this subject. I don't remember what it was called, but you can find on YouTube the documentary that I was watching that inspired this video. It's like a super long 2 or 3 hour documentary. I think it's on Timeline, the historical YouTube channel, perhaps. But yeah, anyway, it's probably easy to find. So check that out. Check out Thaddeus Russell recently going on Michael Malice's podcast and explaining this stupid controversy and misunderstanding over him talking about pedophilia from a philosophical and historical perspective with Stephen Kirchner over a year ago. And check out my last podcast with Dusty and Chris about this the other day. And also, uh, learn about Foucault, read his book called History of Sexuality, and where he talks about how these different categories of sexuality have been created by the Enlightenment, during the modern era, and in order to separate and demonize these people and label them as sinful and medically flawed. And check out just like even if you're critical of James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson in some ways, like I am, check out James Lindsay's book called Cynical Theories and see what you think about it. You maybe you'll disagree with me about some of it. Check out Jordan Peterson's books too. I'm much more of a fan of his newer book called or his oldest book rather, called Maps of Meaning, than his newer self-help stuff. Although I like Beyond Order More Than 12 Rules of Life, and I've been doing a series on that book, so check out that series here on my channel too. And yeah, thanks everyone for watching. Hope you liked this video. Check out my podcast, like I said. Also, probably next week, I'm going to be talking with Parker and doing kind of a debate/conversation about so-called government crack pipes or safe injection sites that have been done by the Biden administration recently, because I agree with that sort of thing, and Parker seems to not do so. And also this weekend, I'm either going to be talking with Dusty and Parker about the book by Neil Gaiman called Norse Mythology, of course, about that subject. And I'll either be doing that podcast, or I'll be talking with Dusty and my fantasy nerd friend Tristram about Sixth of the Dusk, which is a fantasy short story in the Arcanum Unbounded collection by Brandon Sanderson, and in part of his Cosmere fantasy universe. All right, so yeah, check out those previous and upcoming videos, and click that like button, subscribe, click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description of the video as always. Even $1 a month is greatly appreciated. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And the Spartans are a fascinating historical group of people, and it's interesting to examine what we see as moral evils today, like pedophilia and slavery, from a historical and moral and philosophical perspective. And in my opinion, Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay don't know what the fuck they're talking about when they talk about postmodernism and critical race theory. Read these books and learn for yourself, and read Foucault, History of Sexuality, and his other work as well. And read James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson's books too. All right. Thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.